This
Okay,
conference will now
there we
be
go.
recorded.
Right. Okay, so we can now start. So some of you hopefully will remember the event that we had back in November around World Quality Day on the theme of sustainability, which of course at the time was big headlines. It wasn't exactly planned that way, but it did coincide with the big international conference up in Glasgow, COP26. And so very briefly, there were lots of headlines and lots of buzz in the media around sustainability. And the initial idea for this event was a kind of follow-up to that event and to that time of year, and essentially to sort of say, well, you know, there was a lot of fuss at the time and a lot of noise, and everybody was aware of sustainability very much at the time, but where are we now? Several months on, what's happened? Where have we gone? Where do we still need to go? And I'm very pleased we've been able to assemble 3 guest speakers for this event with interestingly different starting points, shall we say, on this whole discussion. David Picton is Senior Vice President, SVP, let's get it right, of Sustainability at Alcumus Group. In addition to his extensive background in the field of sustainability, which I'm sure you've been able to read about on the Eventbrite page, he, unlike most of us, was actually there at COP26. And so we'll be able to give us an insight into some of the discussions that went on there with regard to perhaps resolutions that were made or things that need to be happening on the back of that. Clive Wilson from Prime East, again, hopefully some of you will remember from the November event, with a particular focus on the role of leaders and leadership in determining where businesses need to go, where the world needs to go. Will give us a bit of an insight, I think, into some of the specifics around how organizations are now positioning themselves to align with this sustainability agenda. And Avi, again, you will have seen from the Eventbrite bio, has been very much immersed in the sharp end of sustainability as part of the Fusion project, or Fusion company, involved in the preparatory work for the HS2 project, or a significant chunk of it. So welcome all, thank you for joining us, and without any further blurb from me, I'm going to ask David if you would kick us off, please.
Great, thanks, Stephen, and thanks for having me along this evening. Great to join you. As Stephen said, I'm the Senior Vice President of Sustainability and ESG here at Alcumus. I'll tell you a little bit about us in a minute. The route I took to this role, I'm an ex-Chief Sustainability Officer in the construction and services industry. I was a Chief Sustainability Officer for about 5 or 6 years, and most of my career has been a mix of supply chain, logistics, operations. So I've taken a sort of operational route to come through to that now. And seen a number of different sectors, like the technology sector, briefly at Sky TV as well, at Carillion. So obviously I had quite a different set of experiences there. But great to have the chance to join you tonight. Thank you for that. And as you asked me to cover a few points from COP26, just to give you a view from Glasgow, if you like, and then how that comes together after that. A couple of points first that just might be interesting, a couple of points of context really. In the world of ESG, and we deal in that every day at Alcumus in terms of what we do here, most of what we're doing here at Alcumus is geared towards risk management. If you do or don't know us, we are a technology and solutions company, services and solutions all geared towards risk management. So software, services, certification bodies, audits, and what have you. The 3 main areas that we focus on is really geared towards supply chain compliance. So working with supply chains and their companies, working around ESG, so the environmental, social, and governance aspects of responsible business, and then the sort of wider health, safety, and quality work as well that links into ISO frameworks and ISO benchmarks. We're a UCAS certification body as well. All of that comes together in reality to be a technology focus towards safer, healthier, more responsible business. So that's what took us to Glasgow, if you like. We were focused there because a lot of the work we're doing with clients, we're probably working with about 50,000 companies across the world, mainly in the UK and North America, but we've got some folks down in New Zealand now as well. So it's expanding rapidly across all the continents of the world. And most of that area that we focus on is some of the big clients, the really big players, the enterprise players, and then a huge amount of smaller suppliers to those. So it's the network that joins them, if you like. And most of what we're doing in those technology solutions joins the two folks together, or the two sides of that network together, if you like. But what was interesting is over the last year or so, particularly in an atmosphere of COP as well, a lot of things have brought the words that Stephen was saying really to the fore. If you look at things like science-based targets, which I'm sure you've heard of, the science-based targets, the commitments to those, they've actually doubled in 10 months. So the commitments that companies are making to science-based targets have doubled in the last 10 months. The Carbon Disclosure Project, which is probably one of the world's yardsticks for carbon footprinting and for carbon disclosures, both on behalf of clients and their suppliers. There was a 35% year-on-year increase last year, although nearly 17,000 companies either failed to disclose, having been asked to do so, or didn't provide enough information. So there's a growing recognition, if you like, that despite the growth in that some are still getting it wrong. We did some research of our own last year and showed that around 9 out of 10 of the companies that we talked to last year were either already investing in technology for carbon footprinting and tracking ESG, wider ESG, or were actually planning to do that. So they were either already investing or planning to do that. But what was interesting was that the Boston Consulting Group did some work and showed that around 1 in 10, only 9% of companies actually measure their footprint correctly. And more interesting as well, 3 out of 4 executives, this was some work that EDI did, a sustainability platform, they showed that 3 out of 4 executives actually don't understand their carbon footprint of their organization. So the point about COP26, I guess, is that it operated in a context where there was a huge rush to commit to these kinds of carbon footprinting and climate action, but a very, very mixed picture of what companies, organizations, public sector bodies were actually doing about it. So it was an era of some confusion in a way. So when we went up to COP26, we were there for 3 days in the first week, which was just after the national leaders made all their opening statements on the first 2 or 3 days. So we were then there for the following 3 days, and there was a real buzz. I must admit, it was quite a place to be. It was quite quite an experience to be there and see it. And despite the challenges of the pandemic, of course, this was a really significant event of governments, NGOs, businesses, charities, media, the public, all kinds of people going there. They calculated there was a total of something like 38,457 people attended COP26. Very specific figures, of course, but it made it the largest COP in history. So for all the negativity that you may or may not have heard about it, it was the largest event in history focused around climate action. So a lot of things were discussed, and a lot of things did get done as well. What we did there as a company, we went to the green zone. So we were operating in the green zone, which was where a lot of the displays and the technology and various companies were interacting with members of the public and various attendees of the COP as well. So we got a chance to see the latest thinking from some great companies, both large and small. We ran a thought leadership event with customers as well, and we actually went along to the CBI Business Forum session on the Thursday evening. So we got a chance to see a real cross section, and then we actually just were in the city as well, and a lot of things were happening just around in Glasgow on the streets. We came across a number of protests. We talked to a number of people out there, talked to a lot of police people as well. There was a huge police presence. So as you can probably imagine, it was an extremely busy place to be, but right in the heart of it. Now, picking up Stephen's points, that this idea of what now, if you like, so what happened as a result, I think most of us are aware that there was a lot of negativity that was expressed in the press, but it's not surprising because in a lot of ways that's what the press do. That they pick out the negative aspects of it. But the realities were there was a lot achieved at COP26. There was the Glasgow Climate Pact, which was endorsed by around 200 countries. There were some significant policy commitments alongside new multinational net zero pledges, areas of deforestation, mobilizing finance, cutting methane, phasing down coal. And some people got hung up on the language, but the agreement to phase down coal. So in all honesty, one of the takeaways for us, I think, was to beware the despairism, the notion that we're all doomed, if you like, because in the context of getting things done, that can be a little misguided and counterproductive. What we came away from COP26 with was, I think, a will for action and a belief that we can make a difference. And then fundamentally, the business strategies and the public sector business sort of crossover, if you like, because one of the misconceptions in a way was that climate action or COP26 would be done by governments. Governments made their commitments, absolutely, and they bring policies together, including things like power generation. But in reality, I think the one message we took away was that businesses, organizations, large and small, will be the ones that get this done. So to pick up on Stephen's point, the three areas I think that have come out as big conclusions for us that we've been working on since then. So the what now question, if you like, was that a lot of companies are making carbon reduction a very firm business priority. So that was the first point. Businesses making it a business priority amongst a lot of other competing pressures, actually. And a lot of the people we spoke to there agreed to two or three things that absolutely had to face into this as a business, whether you were large or small. You had to face into it and look for its opportunities. There was a very clear point that this was fundamental to work winning now. So people bidding for contracts, tenders, buyers and suppliers needing to work together on credible sort of common evidence, if you like. And there were some real opportunities for adjacencies, areas that you might not have considered before, different ways of investing, perhaps bringing innovation to life or striking new partnerships, because it was very clear that this wouldn't be done by any one organization or any one sector. It would have to be done across sector with those partnerships all working together. What we also found was there were significant brand benefits, if you like, and significant customer motivations that were driving that through. But in terms of making carbon reduction a business priority, there was a simple agreement that I've got a little acronym, if you like, which I call LIFT, which stands for Learn, Identify, Focus, and Try. That making it happen, bringing carbon reduction to life, was a cyclic process where no one had all the answers, and a lot of people needed to come away from the fear of getting things wrong, if you like, because this is really about learning what mattered, identifying what you could change and what you could go after, and that might be as simple as a change in procurement policy or different energy use or areas like that, focusing in on those and then working out what you could impact, and then trying some things, just trying some different initiatives, tracking the results, and if it was wrong, then you could change direction. So I think it was that idea of learn, identify, focus, and try that would underpin making it a business priority. So it was the first thing, was that businesses, organizations, and all of the ecosystem around businesses, advisors, auditors, their staff, everyone would get this done if they leaned into it. The second area, I think, was working with the supply chain. That came very strongly to the fore, is that supply chains were one of the most complex areas to address in climate change action, because if you took a typical enterprise and then looked at its supply chain, the scope 3 emissions within its supply chain could be up to 11 times greater than its own emissions. So that was a really significant takeaway point, was that, like never before, to get carbon reduction in flight, to make climate action happen, if you like, companies needed to engage with their supply chains, and particularly international supply chains, of course, which were different in every country. A lot of these things were back-to-back commitments within tenders. So you had one client committing to something on behalf of their client, and then they had to make their supply chain come along as well. So there was a need for a lot of cascade effect and talking as things went through. But there was also an opportunity to identify some joint benefits, ways that you could have cost control, because of course, particularly now with surging energy prices, anything that cuts carbon, anything that cuts energy, cuts cost as well. So there was a very clear business case for investment and thinking this through in a different way. And what most people agreed was that it could be overwhelming if you try to do all of that supply chain at once. So the best place to start was a sort of 80-20 approach, if you like, to follow the areas of greatest spend or to follow the areas of greatest risk, but to start somewhere on the focused areas and just start to achieve a bit of a beachhead, a little bit of progress, a little bit of momentum, if you like. But the supply chain, phenomenally complex area, and people were looking for information and how to help, if you like. One of the areas that came out was the Supply Chain Sustainability School. I'm not sure if you've seen it or heard of it, but if you just Google the Supply Chain Sustainability School, it's a UK initiative. I used to be one of the board directors when I was a Chief Sustainability Officer. And it's a free resource. You get a chance just to dive in and see anything that you wanted to learn about, you can just join for free with your email and get a chance to access their resources. So yeah, really worth having a look if you haven't seen that before. And then just finally, I don't want to hog the whole show, of course, just a final point that we came out. So business priority, supply chain. The third point that came out was to engage people in meaningful change. And that brings back that point of being aware of despairism, if you like, and being aware of negative media coverage, because this is a really powerful way to engage people, and climate change will only happen through people's actions and their motivations. So in a lot of ways, we need to change some of the language, find new ways to hear and bring out different employee voices, get people to understand how they can contribute to this in a positive way, and in different companies perhaps actually look at ways of having sort of future leaders groups, if you like, that might take this on as a project. Working with schools, because a lot of companies of course do volunteering programs, so they might find ways to link any volunteering they do with schools and then link that to climate engagement activities or climate projects as well. But at the end of the day, it was about having a bit of fun as well. There was a lot of doom expressed, a lot of guilt, a lot of anxiety, a lot of protest, a lot of anger, none of which was particularly helpful to move this forward in a positive way. So I'm reminded of Margaret Mead's word, if you like, that she said, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed individuals can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. So I think the final point we took away from COP26 was this was all about people. This would only get done through people, everyone doing their little bit, even if that was one small thing, but that we could hopefully start to turn the supertanker around in time. So that's me, hoping that was helpful, but Stephen, back to you. Just a quick canter through what happened at COP26 and what's happened since then.
Quick indeed, yes. Thanks, David. I appreciate we were sort of asking you to shoehorn an awful lot of stuff into just a few minutes. I did wonder, there were a couple of resources that you mentioned, David, whether it would be possible to just put links to any of those in the chat so that people might be able to pick those up.
I will. I'll pop the links to the school in the chat. It's a great idea.
That would be brilliant. Thank you if you could. Yeah. And it's also nice to hear, you know, as you've said, the positive side of the event from somebody who was actually there. There was a little bit of a temptation, wasn't there, at the end of it, that everybody sort of came out a bit down mouth because of, as you say, the wording of the final resolutions and so on.
Indeed.
Very interesting, though, to hear you picking up on the point about the criticality of supply chain and obviously scope 3 emissions and so on, because that feeds directly into your area, Clive, doesn't it? Clive, again, some of you will know, specialises very much in leadership aspects of business. And what you've called purposeful leadership. And we explored the meaning of purpose at your last presentation and what that should all be about. And there was a lovely line in the discussions that we had leading up to this event, Clive, where you talked about quality managers and quality professionals traditionally thinking in terms of leadership as delivering objectives to meet requirements, to meet specifications, and perhaps there's a little bit of a shift needed now where part of those objectives need to encompass the idea of making the world a better place and not just delivering on specific contractual requirements.
Well, thank you, Stephen, and thank you, David. That's a great link. I'm so glad I followed you because there is so much to build upon, David. I love what you said about businesses will probably be the ones that get things done. That's certainly been a large part of my experience. And also, as Stephen picked up on, the supply chains, just how important that will be to provide that cascade effect that when particularly some of the big corporates begin to align, as many have done, to sustainability. And it's one thing looking at their own operations, but then it's whatever feeds into that through the supply chain. And you mentioned the 11-fold effect of the scope 3 emissions. And I think that same thing applies to all aspects of sustainability. And I wanted to draw the distinction. I know your talk, David, was largely about COP26, which is focusing on climate change. are very important, but nevertheless one of 17 of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And I think the same can be said for all 17 goals, that you can look at what effect you're having in your own business, but never ever neglect what's going on in all those supply chains. In fact, only this week I've been engaging with a company that is involved in solar energy, and now they're beginning to ask questions about where do the panels come from, where does the silicon that goes in the panels come from, making sure that in trying to solve the climate crisis, they're not having knock-on effects in things like equality of employment rights and modern day slavery and goodness knows what else. So it is so important to look into the supply chain. And I also loved what you said, David, about doom and gloom and the need to be positive and to build on hope. In fact, when I wrote my book, Designing the Purposeful World, which has the subtitle, The Sustainable Development Goals as a Blueprint for Humanity, there's a whole chapter that is built on the back of reasons for hope. And the thing that prompted me to write that chapter was the work of Al Gore. And I think it was about 7 years ago, I watched, I don't know if they're still on the internet, they probably are, but he had 24 one-hour videos on reasons for hope on climate change. And I remember one weekend watching all 24, so that tells you what sort of a sad character I am. But I was so impressed with his optimism that I decided to write a whole chapter and find some reasons for hope for each of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. So just to sort of go back to the beginning for me, as Stephen said, my specialism is purposeful leadership. I work for a company called Prime East that has been looking at leadership and teamwork and organisational change since 1987. And I coined the phrase purposeful leadership, which I defined as consciously creating the conditions for a better future. And actually, with everything that's going on in the world, there has never been a more appropriate and necessary time to start thinking about that better future. I mean, when I first wrote Designing the Purposeful World, I'd written Designing the Purposeful Organisation with some principles about how to build on purpose and vision for organisations. And in the very last chapter, I decided that the same principles could be applied to the whole world, and that what we needed was a vision. Well, I wrote that in 2014, and at the end of 2014, the first draft of the UN Sustainable Development Goals landed on my desk. I read them over Christmas. I was just blown away. This was almost like something sent from heaven, a vision for what humanity could be like by the end of the decade. And this decade has become to resonate with a lot of people as being a crucial decade. I know the goals came out in 2015, but really it's the 2020s when they've really started to bite. In fact, in 2015, 2016, I was so disappointed that most of the people in business that I spoke to had never heard of the Sustainable Development Goals. And it's really only in the last 2 or 3 years that I think organizations have been turning in that direction. And so, some of the things that I wanted to talk about were, what is happening in this decade? And as I mentioned last time I was here at the Chartered Quality Institute, we live in an age of disruption. And if you don't believe that, then I would encourage you to read the Rethink X report. It's just Rethink with an X at the end. You can Google it, and you can download a free book called Rethinking Humanity. And the thought leaders there from a think tank in California at Rethink X have predicted 5 major disruptions that will occur in this decade, the 2020s. So these are not things that will happen, they are things that are happening. And when you read them, you'll just be blown away at the pace of change. And David has touched on some of them already, particularly in energy, the disruption in energy as we move to renewables, but combine that with the disruption in transport as we move to, again, electric vehicles, hydrogen vehicles, autonomous vehicles, transport sharing, and so on, but also materials with the advent of 3D printing and the like. Food completely blew my mind when I realized that we can now make meat in a test tube or even in a factory by building on stem cells. We don't have to kill animals anymore. We can just take stem cells from any animal and create steaks in a factory. It's amazing. And this meat is already on sale at price parity in Singapore. And the prediction is by the end of the decade, it'll cost you a 10% of what it would cost to buy a slaughterhouse. So, you know, there's the opportunity here for massive transformation. And what can we do with that land that used to go to pasture? And the fifth disruption, of course, is in information. Now, if you combine that with everything that's happened, the Rethink X report came out before some of the things that we're experiencing now. But if you think about climate change, which David has spoken about, if you think about the pandemic, which has disrupted our lives significantly, but also caused all sorts of advances in technology. And if you think about the current awful situation in Ukraine, the world has got to get some real answers for creating that better future that I talked about when I defined purposeful leadership. So it is so important that organizations align to a better future. And one of the pieces of literature that has really, again, inspired me in the last year has been the book by Paul Polman, which is Net Positive. And the thing that I like about Polman's idea of net positive is that it's talking about being positive in all aspects of our business. And it links some of the things that David has spoken about with regard to supply chain. So Polman makes the point that you may be doing the world amazing good in your core business, whatever it may be, but as a byproduct, if you're causing all sorts of other pain or plundering scarce materials or adding to climate change, then it's just not good enough. And you know, you've got to actually add the sum total of all your activities and make sure you're not doing any harm, not just in your core business, not just in your operations, but also making sure that in the supply chain there isn't all sorts of untoward things happening that are causing damage to humanity and the world in which we live. So I really commend Polman's book Net Positive to you all. Just take a look at that and be inspired. I think the thing that I wanted to really mention was, as Stephen said, was leadership, and leadership coupled with quality, because if you think about it, leadership is all about creating conditions for that better future. And by conditions, I mean things like a clear purpose, a powerful vision, engaging with all stakeholders, putting in place systems and processes, and the behaviors and culture that will get things done. So leaders have to do that, but how can we actually prove to the world, to our stakeholders, that we're doing it? Well, enter the role of the quality professional, because that's what people do in quality, as far as I understand it. In the 1990s, I ran a factory that refurbished electricity meters, and that was my first introduction to total quality management. We had to prove the quality of the processes that produce those meters. And it's exactly the same when it comes to the Sustainable Development Goals. If we're going to claim that we're contributing to the Sustainable Development Goals, then we have to be able to prove that and prove it in the supply chain as well. Well, who better than quality engineers and quality professionals to help leaders to compile the data that is necessary to prove to people that what we're saying is not simply greenwash. So leadership is so important, and leaders getting together outside the confines of their own organization and working with others. I worked with a company that does energy monitoring and energy management recently, and we were talking about the electricians that were needed to go and fit solar panels and everything else, and he was saying how much he revelled in training them in the methods. Now, bearing in mind, they didn't work directly for him. I said, do you not feel you're giving away the crown jewels, teaching them all your secrets? He said, the world needs more solar panels than I could ever fit. So I don't care how many people learn from what we do, because this is information that needs to be copyright free, if you like. It's a bit like Elon Musk when he put his batteries and the patents for his electric cars into the public domain. There is so much that needs to be done, and there is so much opportunity. I think one final thing that I'd like to say, Stephen, as well, is that it's not just the supply chains. If you think about the materials, it's also supply chains when it comes to finance, because the other big thing that is happening is the way that investment funds are aligning behind organizations that are aligning to the Sustainable Development Goals. There now are investment funds that will invest in nothing but that. And so I'm minded of Mark Carney, when he, who was the past governor of the Bank of England, when he spoke at the Reef Lectures a year or two ago, and he talked about the sunset sectors, and he urged banks and investors not to invest in companies that weren't for the good of the world. And I think people are beginning to really take notice of that and switch where they invest their money, be that individuals, be it banks or investment houses. So everything is aligning to the Sustainable Development Goals, and I think businesses have got a choice to either work out in what way they align to the Sustainable Development Goals and make sure everybody knows about it, or they go out of business, because they'll find themselves in a very lonely place as the world turns towards those 17 Sustainable Development Goals, and even beyond 2030, everything that they stand for. I think those are the main points I wanted to get across, Stephen. I hope that works for everybody.
Yes, thank you for that, Clive. That was a really interesting follow-on, actually, from the sort of top-level view from COP and the meetings of the various governmental bodies, and David's take on the involvement of other businesses through your sketch through leadership and supply chains and how they need to be taken into account. And it's beginning to sound as though there's a real head of steam building up, where, as you say, you know, people are going to be the odd ones out if they don't jump on board. It's almost, I don't know whether it's quite got there yet, but it's kind of sounding a little bit like the ISO 9001 drive. You know, that it became an imperative driven down the supply chain, such that if you weren't there, you were left out. And it's interesting that you mentioned the role of the quality manager as well, which perhaps going back a few years, we wouldn't automatically have associated with the discussions that we're having now around sustainability. And increasingly we're able to join up those dots and to align the disciplines and understand how they all need to be lined up and facing in the same direction. And with that in mind, we happen to have, as our third speaker, exactly one of those, a quality manager who's been very much involved in sustainability in a type of project where one might have had question marks as to how central that was to the delivery of the project. So Avi, please let us into the know. Tell us all about it.
Thanks a lot, Stephen. If it's okay, I was just going to share some slides, if that's okay.
Please do. So, I think you're an organizer, aren't you? So I think if you just share your screen, I think you can do that.
Okay. Can you see this okay?
Yep, that's fine. Yep.
Okay. So you have to excuse me because I'm showing my screen right now. I can't see anybody, or I won't be able to see any questions. And I think hopefully we'll do those towards the end of which will be my very brief presentation here. So thank you, Stephen. Yes, I am doing the role of a quality manager for High Speed 2, working on the enabling works, which is the early stage works, as you said before, for High Speed 2. And this then leads on to the main works project, which is obviously building the railway. So if it's okay, I'm going to make a quick start on this. So covering really sustainability in the construction sector, and the context is High Speed 2, HS2, the enabling stage work. So the area that and the project that I've been working on since 2018 is called Fusion. And what I'll do is I'll go through this. I'll just make reference as well to what I'm so sorry, right? I'm trying to think now. Was it Clive who wrote the book? So I'll make reference to the earlier speakers and the comments they made, because on this project as well, we use the Alchemist system, which is called the SHEP tracker, for monitoring and recording information at Fusion, and of course the role of leadership. So that kind of weaves itself very nicely into the overview that I'm going to give you. So mine is going to be more of a storytelling style that I'm going to cover really about Fusion. So Fusion is, as it says on here, I'm not going to read it out verbatim, but Fusion is basically a project-based organisation. And as it says here, fully integrated, incorporated joint venture that connects 3 of the UK's most experienced infrastructure companies. So I don't know how much people are aware of HS2. And what you'll find is you won't ever really just have one company doing an element of works. It's always done within a joint venture style of management and contract. And part of that is obviously sharing ideas, knowledge, this type of thing. But of course, as well, it's minimizing risk. I think a few people are already probably aware of companies such as Carillion, companies that have gone into administration. So it just means that the other companies are able to pick up that work or as well make changes if needed. So the companies within Fusion itself are the company that as well, which I work for, is Morgan Sindel Infrastructure. We also have BAM Natel, which has a excuse me, a Dutch background, and of course the UK side for overall. There was also a small element of work for Amy. Oh, excuse me, I jumped ahead there. So the project was awarded on the 17th of November 2016. And as it says here, Fusion was awarded the HS2 Phase 1 enabling works contract for the central area. So I'm just going to go down and show you on this diagram here, the actual central section. So you can see the trace of HS2 itself, and you can see on the section here now, Fusion is in the central section. So those are the 3 companies joined together working on this area. In the north, we have LMJV, which is Lang O'Rourke, J. Murphy and Sons. And in the south, we have the CSJV, Costain Group and Skanska. So you notice the difference in the actual size of the projects as well. So even though this is showing it in the length, the actual project goes sideways as well. So it's actually a really large area that needs to be covered. There was just slightly different aspects of work. So for CSJV, they were in the Euston side, so there's a lot very built up, very heavily populated. So their kind of challenges and risks that they were trying to overcome would be slightly different compared to what Fusion was working on and is still working on, compared to LMJV, who had probably slightly more demolition in their section of works. But yes, the central section in the role and the company that I've been working for was and is extremely large. And this is the area of works that we covered. So we did everything from demolition works to ecology, environmental. And I think this just ties back in really looking at the ecology and the environmental, the historic environment, the archaeological works, and as well the sort of, the utilities and the watercourse activities. All of this work really does come back into looking at the environmental markers, the sort of neutral types of environmental markers to say that environmental, sustainability is being operationalized on the project itself. It's not just something we talk about. I want to just tell you, sort of weave just a few stories. I have many stories because I've been within Fusion since 2018. But obviously I can't tell you about all of those. There's way too many. So I'm going to tell you a few that since I've been in Fusion and, as Stephen said, immersed, partly using these type of languages as well because I'm doing further study. And this is another reason why I joined Fusion, was because I needed an area and a case study which will help me along my journey on the study that I'm doing. So this workshop took place in 2018. I had joined in the February 2018, so I hadn't been at Fusion very long. And for me, this was extremely interesting because of the language that was being used. So this was called a workshop on pre-construction and transition to project delivery. So even though the company had been formed in 2017, they were doing a lot of their sort of pre-tender works, design, putting work out to subcontractors, going out to the market, this type of thing. And the idea of this transition was the project needed to transition into, now we're going to deliver works. We're no longer just going to sit and talk about things and do design. We're actually getting out there to do this type of work. And the interesting thing is, you have to excuse me, this is probably not the best picture here, but this, even though this aspect that was covered here was equality, diversity, and inclusion, it was interesting just to see the language that was being used. What are your feelings about our culture? So it's quite interesting because I find the subject of culture extremely interesting, and that's really an area that I think is very important. But also the fact that it's asking about feelings, and of course the higher level of kind of promotion around equality, diversity, and inclusion within the world of H2, and of course on Mainworks itself. What you can see here on the right hand side is the team together. They're actually doing painting, so they're talking about not talking necessarily, but expressing themselves with paint. So there's just a range of people there doing this type of work. And here we've got the program director at the time, or the delivery director, doing his painting as well. And this is at that time the managing director. So since 2018, the project itself has had 4 project directors. So that kind of shows you the kind of within the project environment itself. Even though this is in a way talking about EDI, the subjects that were covered on this transition workshop was really a lot of subjects covered, not just EDI. Quality management was covered in here, contract management, environmental and sustainability as well. So these are just the kind of the work that was done in the session that day, of how people were able to express themselves in this kind of in using this kind of methodology to paint, which meant that everybody had a chance to talk about their paintings and just express that, instead of it being like a spreadsheet and we'll just talk about these things and you read through it and it's actually not that interesting. It just meant that was a very good session that day. What I noticed from this is just looking back at my notes from that particular session, and this is one of the areas that I wanted to highlight to you today. There was a debate on the environmental requirements of the client HS2 and how onerous these were. There was no comment from the environmental and sustainability manager that day. So this is just something I observed on the project itself. I think for people who know the industry or have an idea of the industry, sometimes construction infrastructure itself doesn't always come across that well. It's seen as a laggard. An industry that needs to sort itself out. It's got a number of initiatives always going over it, being pulled up for something. So it was quite interesting to hear that day, because I remember thinking, actually, this whole project, the whole of Fusion, majority of the work is environmental and ecology, and that's what we're here to do. And it was quite interesting to hear people think, well, this is way too onerous, and not much come from the environmental sustainability manager. So, and since then, I'm going to talk a little bit about where it's come. So these are just some other reflections really of how people got on, how much information was shared in the forum of, using the hand painting and poetry, this type of thing. Oops, excuse me. This was another meeting. It was done, I think, the year after or in the same year. So this is a note following a BAT workshop. So this, once again, to look at the kind of neutral environmental markers to show actually, how are we working on the project and what we're actually doing. So it was really interesting because instead of being in a traditional kind of, we're building a structure or we're going to dig a ditch or we're going to do this other stuff over here and we're just moving all of these, shrub and this landscape out of the way. It's really interesting because even though there was a large amount of movement that had to be done, there was a lot of work to make sure that the BAT mitigation, as it says on here, the pre-tender for the bat mitigation workshop, yeah, it says 2018 on that slide, was carried out. So this was the scope of looking at the areas that would be looked at. And at this stage, Fusion was going out to talk to specialist contractors who were going to help do this work. So the main part of Fusion's work really was a lot around ecology, around, badger mitigation, water voles, moving, translocating fish, planting trees, and of course, as it says on here, the bat planning meeting. And what was really interesting on this meeting, this and each of these meetings, if I think back now and I look back at my notes, there certainly weren't light in attendance. On this meeting, there was probably about 50 people present. So it just kind of shows you the kind of input, not just from Fusion itself and for subcontractors, but the client as well, coming to see how works were progressing. And as it says here, the ecologist required to supervise all works in this section. So going back to the start of Fusion, there was a lot of, at the start of the project, there was many people with a civil engineering background. And I remember thinking at the time when I joined, I'm not sure if this balance is quite right, really looking at the type of work that is going to be done here. And gradually over the period, what you found is we still needed the number of civil engineers that we had, because there's still those elements of works. But actually the environment, ecology, sustainability team got much bigger. From when I joined, it was around 10 people, and at its peak it had 45. So it just kind of shows you the difference within that team itself. Within the quality team as well, when I joined 2018, there was only 2 of us, and at the peak of works there was 11 of us. So kind of shows you at the level we needed to be at, because with the Hybrid Bill Act and the Works Information Technical Standards that have been written, there's a real high level of requirements within those, and obviously the evidence and traceability that needs to be recorded within this. So this kind of just shows you some of the areas that we were looking at within this scope of works around the bats. And you do see a similar pattern if you were looking at badgers or voles, or building a badger set, this type of thing. And this is an interesting story really around St Mary's Church. So I don't know how many people would have seen the Big Dig. That's been, I think that was shown just around Christmas time or the start of the new year. And this was included one of the sites for Fusion, which is St Mary's. This is what St Mary's used to look like before, in the past. And so you have to excuse me, I don't have the photo of what it looked like when we went in, but basically it was just like grass. The church wasn't there anymore. This was in 2018. I did a site visit with my colleague here, Rachel, and we met the 2 archaeologists at that time in a very small porter cabin. So this was the start of basically St Mary's archaeological works. It was just a very small cabin with just 2 people, and myself and Rachel visited that day. I haven't put any sort of more photography up following on from there, because really it's just like a field, and this is what it become. So you can see the kind of journey it was on from 2018, a very small porter cabin, and there was just lots of grass, to actually we had a design for this tent. This had a proper drainage system on it. It was that massive. It had a full blown kind of foundation around the edges here, and it had this was in itself properly constructed and engineered. It had a full design. I think if you've seen the Big Dig, then you'd see the sort of scale of this, but you can see the people here, and these are all the different levels they're digging into. So it was really, I always remember the shock of going to this site and thinking, this was absolutely minuscule when I first visited, and then in 2019 it was just a field with few areas that people were looking at. To actually now we have this really huge tent, and the BBC are coming to record to see what's going on. And then what happened was, in order to engage with as well the local community, for people to see the work that's been going on, they opened up what they called the St Mary's Field Museum. I have a lot more photography than this, but I just wanted to show you this is how they set it up as a little museum. And throughout it all, you've got some of the artifacts they found within the ground, so that the local people and really anyone could have visited and seen what they found. So sometimes I know when we think about sustainability, it can be more towards the environmental aspects, or some of the social sustainability aspects. But of course, the historic environment is really important as well. And it was in this dig here that they found the secondary layer, I think, of the church, where they found the Roman remains and the almost intact bust, and a lot of very fascinating artifacts that were found, which is, I think there's only one of those. There's only another one in America being found from that Roman time. So it was really, really interesting. This is going to have actually the railway line going over the top of it. So this work was really, really important to have done this at the stage that we did, because there wouldn't have been an opportunity to come back and do this again. So really, it was quite short, my presentation, but it's kind of to show you really from an operational point of view. Sometimes, as both David, Clive, and as well Stephen has mentioned, sometimes things that are said in theory, what does that actually look like in practice? And actually looking at the construction and infrastructure sector, it can sometimes be looked at in a little bit of a doom and gloom way, and actually you're not doing any of the right stuff, and as well the challenges of trying to get quality right within the sector itself. But really, I have to say, from looking at the journey, being immersed in fusion for over 4 years, there has been some really incredible work. And some very dedicated people with very long hours to do the work that we have done, and try and bring it this year to a close, because of course this now needs to pass on to EKFB for the stages of actually building the railway. But I just wanted to show you those few stories, just to show you this kind of the elements of work around bats, and of course as well then looking at this journey from 2018, looking at the archaeological works, and from what a small start it had to where it become. And this had a very large dedicated team. It had drying rooms and all sorts, so it was really, really fascinating. So if I just come out of this, and I was going to go to the last slide here. I think just coming back to some of the earlier points as well, looking at your supply chain and your subcontractors, because the reality is any of the main works that are working for HS2, there's only so much of the work that we do ourselves. You know, we tend to be the main works contractor. So a large aspect of works is obviously passed out to specialist subcontractors, which clearly for, you know, as David mentioned earlier on, that is where a significant amount of your risk does lay. But of course, as well, it's something that HS2 is looking for. They expect us to put 70 to 80% of the work out to small to medium-sized enterprises, and part of that is not just a specialist, and some of this is very, you know, unique work, but of course to build those companies up as well. So it has been very, very interesting, and at times extremely challenging as well. So I hope that helps. And if I come out of here now and I'll stop sharing, I don't know if anyone has any questions. Thank you,
Stephen,
Stephen.
it's Michelle. There are no questions on the chat, but there have been lots of useful links provided. So thank everybody that's provided that information.
I just, in advance of any questions coming in on the chat, there's something I just wondered about, bouncing back to the previous two speakers, because one of the words that you mentioned, Avi, there was culture. And I know you and I have talked about this sort of culture shift from when you first came into the Fusion project, and you kind of expected to walk into this, you know, very macho, very sort of, you know, steel and ditches sort of culture. And you've mentioned this sort of transition that you've seen in the culture of the project, and also the fact that, which is also sort of quite encouraging, that some of the very, very detailed work that you've had to do, and you've mentioned bats and you mentioned water voles, and I know we've talked about great crested newts and other things along the way.
Yeah.
Are they're not just nice to haves, and they're not just being done because there is a legal protection over bats as a species, for example, but they're actually built in to the delivery standards of the project. So
Yes.
I wonder, that sounds very suspiciously like, coming back to both David and Clive, really.
Yeah, it does, yeah.
That sounds very much like a sort of leadership role from the top down in terms of how the specifications are being built, with sustainability considerations in mind, and with other deliverables than simply, as you say, a railway line that's going to go from A to B. And I wonder, you know, how far that sort of thing is going to be the template for the future.
I think, Stephen, that is a template for the future. I think that if we look at HS2, we haven't had this type of work for probably 100 years in this country, you know, from when the original railways were built. So probably back in the day, cut and carve, chuck things to one side, doesn't really matter if you drop it in the river, all this type of thing. But then if you look at health and safety back in the day, how many people died a week or had life-changing injuries, you know? So there's been a massive culture change in health and safety. But the reality is this industry is not a health and safety consultancy. We deliver work. You know, we change the environment. We have a built environment. So we have a responsibility for this as well. So I think looking at the Hybrid Bill Act, looking at the green infrastructure, the technical standards, the requirements around this, it really is like Clive and David were saying. It's already being done because this was in the making probably about 12 years ago before it even started. So it shows you already what's been going on behind the scenes. But of course, one thing I noticed in 2018 when I joined the project was thinking, are people really ready for this? Because I remember reading the works information and having to almost think, I've got to go back to the drawing board. I feel like I don't know what I'm doing here. And I thought, no, I do know what I'm doing, but it's very confusing because the language was so different. You know, we were talking about UNAs, undertaking an assurance, which were part of the Hybrid Bill Act. You know, so it could be something simple as you will not cross Farmer X's footpath, and that's into actually the Hybrid Bill Act. So if you breach that, somebody in HS2 is going to end up in the Houses of Parliament explaining themselves. So it was really interesting looking at consents, looking at the level of the environment requirements, and of course then the ecology, and as well the amount of planting that was being done. And a lot of this material, like the trees, was actually being supplied by HS2 themselves. It wasn't something we were going out to the market and sourcing ourselves. So just looking at some of the challenges of the stuff coming in substandard, or you know, conditions not being right. So it's been really, really fascinating because I suppose in a way I probably had a frame of mind which was, oh, it's going to be like this. And there was some of that early language that I talk about. You know, there was lots of the discharge to the subcontractor, it's not my responsibility. You know, there was this type of language. Now what I notice when I'm in meetings, people actually get tangled up over saying badger or bat because they're talking about them so much. You know, you can be in a delivery progress meeting with 30 senior managers. The whole conversation is around badger and bat surveys, natural England. Did you get that license? No, hold on a minute. Why have you breached here? Whereas before, in that first meeting where I said 2018, this is onerous. And I was surprised at the time that the sustainability manager didn't say anything because I, at that stage, I hadn't been there very long, but I already knew this is actually the work that you're here to do. So it's not onerous. This is actually what we are delivering. And if you can understand that, then you will know how to measure and monitor and make sure you do those things correctly. But as Clive was saying about the aspect of leadership and, you know, being responsible and caring about this type of work, I think looking at the directors, we've had that type of leadership really throughout Fusion itself. But I think as well, there's this sort of, how can I say it? There's also a term which is called the operators group, like your middle managers. You need to make sure that it's in this level as well. Otherwise, those directions don't go very well. And as much as I talk about these stories, there's also some very harsh learning curves where people have got it quite wrong because they haven't listened and they've had to learn it the hard way, which has meant they then come back and say, I kind of wish I'd listened to you before because it would have been a lot easier for me. So, yeah, there is, as you say, Stephen, the culture, the leadership, and of course the earlier point that David made as well.
I know one of the things, David, that we talked about that was addressed at the group that you chaired, I think at COP, was this question of how can we get business leaders to give cognizance to sustainability, to the ecology, to preserving historical sites, you know, that may be along the route, when there's so many other business priorities. You know, they've got to make ends meet, they've got to pay the bills, they've got to somehow juggle the, you know, the rising costs of raw materials and energy and all these other things. How do you fit
you're
that
right.
in?
It was exactly this. This was really the essence of the conversations we're having. You know, when you've got so many competing priorities, and if you look at where we are as a, I think, you know, we could talk all night about it. I know, but if you look at where we are as a world as well, I mean, just in the last couple of weeks, that, you know, the horrors and the difficulties that have arisen with the Russian-Ukraine situation as well, and then the knock-on effects that will have, and we're coming off the back of 2 years of a pandemic which isn't over yet, and that was coming off the back of Brexit disruption which isn't over yet, and that was, you know, when you look at all of these things that have made us well aware that international trading is so difficult, if you like, it's really brought home to us the fragility of trading and operations in the economy. So to your point, any companies or organizations or bodies, if you like, that are thinking they can operate in isolation anymore, you know, are deluding themselves in reality. So I think a lot of the people we're talking to is recognizing that climate change, extreme climate events, knock-on effects in the supply chain, all of it is connected really for this idea of much more enduring business, if you will. And although you can't do it all at once, and absolutely no one can do it on their own, any organizations which aren't structuring in that strategy, proper practical action plans, and doing something about this, they're going to struggle to attract customers. So they're going to struggle to keep business and win new business. They're certainly going to struggle to attract and keep the best talent in the market as well, because so many conversations, of course, are happening around retention and attraction, about the purpose of a company, you know, picking up on Clive's point about purposeful organizations. You know, it's a really key point to attract the best talent and keep it, and then develop that talent as well. And of course, who do these execs and businesses think will take their business forward if not this talent? You know, so I think it is all inextricably linked, really, and that's what we're seeing as a recognition. 10 years ago, it might have been a nice story, if you like, and as a CSO, when I was there, you know, some of my early work was a little bit like pushing a snowball uphill on a hot day. It really was, you know, it was a really tough piece of work, really, but not so much now, and that extends across most of the verticals that we work with.
That sounds positive and encouraging, and indeed what we've heard from all three of the speakers has been really quite positive and encouraging. So so it's been interesting hearing you all. Thank you. I'm not aware, Michelle, that there's a lot of questions coming in on the chat. Michelle, you there?
Yeah,
Nothing
just get a quick view. Yeah, there's nothing to add.
Nothing to
no
add.
Questions there, as I say, just the useful links to information.
Which there are, which I think we can actually save, can't we? Because I think once we come out of this meeting, we lose that, don't we? I don't think we have access to those links. Rimmel might correct me on this. I don't know, but I suspect, I'm just going into the chat, there's a button up on the top right there, which I thought was for actually exporting or saving the chat, but I'm not sure if it is actually. So, Rimmel, can you help us? Not sure if there's a way of saving the links that the guys have helpfully posted.
You've got a question for Avi as well there, Stephen. In fact, several questions for Avi.
Okay.
Sorry, I didn't realise that there was questions for me. Right, okay.
Right.
Okay. So what have we got here? Shall I read the question? Forming
Yes.
Forming a JV, a joint venture that kind of served as a horizontal integration purpose was a good idea. And how was it regarded by any competitors in the sector? That's the first question. There's a few questions. Do you want me to read them all out and then, or do you want me to read each one and then answer each one?
Is it all right if I answer one at a time, because otherwise?
Yeah, sure. So forming a joint venture that kind of served as a horizontal integration purpose was a good idea. How was it regarded by competitors in the sector?
Well, in order to apply for work and to tender for work. So I think if you're familiar with this within the construction sector, you'll normally be, there's forums or ways of finding out when new work is coming through, and the client will tell you what those requirements are. So if you go forward and you're going to bid for work, so for example, if I look at Fusion, if we look at let's look at two different organisations. If we look at BVV, which is Balfour, Beatty and Vinci, they're actually an organisation that regularly works together. So BVV has set themselves up as an organisation which goes forward for, complex tunnelling types of works, because that's where their strength is. Fusion itself, it's quite actually very interesting. Fusion was formed for the purpose of HS2. So Morgan for overall and BAM Natal came together and formed a three-way joint venture. So it's always quite interesting in the joint ventures because you have slightly different cultures in each company, and you're then trying to bring them together. So that itself can be very interesting, bring its own challenges, and have some serious comedy moments. So even though it's a good idea, and clearly there's a lot of good stuff in this, for any competition, really the idea is if there is competition within this sector, it's going to be the same. You apply for works, and this is then awarded on the merit of your the tender that you put in. I know that HS2, when they look at tenders, they are literally in sealed rooms that are soundproof, with someone standing at that door, and it is done in a unbiased way. So there's none of this business about a brown envelope with money in it, hoping that you can get in there. Or football tickets, this type of stuff. It's quite regulated because HS2 itself is a government organisation. I think they're part of Department of Transport, so it's very serious. You can't just bypass those things. So if you're a competitor, it can be quite disappointing if you don't get works. I mean, for Fusion itself, the forming of the joint venture was to get main works. That's where a lot of the money is. So if I look at BVV, who's doing the northern side, their contract value is 6 billion. Fusion, which I've been on, started at about 100. By the time we finish, it's going to be around 800 million. And I've seen the scale of work involved in this. So it really is massive. It's very massive, complex work. Yeah. I hope that answers that question.
Yeah, the question was asked by Neri, so hopefully that answers the question. The next one is, could the three companies be awarded contracts separately for different works and at different times? I think you've touched on that actually.
Yeah, and I can give you a real life example. Fusion, and goes back to culture as well. Fusion itself at the start, as I said, it formed itself to do main works, and then realised they didn't win main works, but they got enabling works. So it becomes, oh, okay, well, we didn't get main works, but we got enabling works. And I think from looking at what I've seen within Fusion, I'd say it's so fascinating. Actually, it wouldn't have been something you'd be disappointed with, really, unless, of course, you just want to build big structures. So what happened was, throughout the first 15 months of Fusion, Morgan Sindall took itself out of Fusion. So Fusion then became Fusion will only be here while the enabling works is running. Once it draws to an end, it doesn't exist anymore after that period, because Morgan Sindall took themselves out. So what happened was, when Carillion, I think it's Carillion, when they went into administration, Carafage, which is doing main works, they were struggling with losing that section of the joint venture. So what happened was EKFB was formed. So you've got F, which is for overall, and BAM. So FB came together. So now you have in main works EKFB. So what happens is people just go slightly to separate ways, but you still continue to work in the area that you've been contracted to. Hope that makes sense.
Yeah, lovely. And the next question, we've got 4 in total here, Ovie. Do you find courses useful for business processes, supply and demand matters, and higher efficiency and decreasing carbon footprint of operations in a sector with high emissions and waste?
I think in order to answer this question, so I think it's got different. How can I say this? It's got different dimensions, really, because always joining forces, that's always a good thing, and you can have cultures that align or might be slightly different. and yeah, you can always improve what you do. But I think the reality is the way the HS2 contract is written, and look, I know it's going to sound like a very strange thing to say, but it's almost taking the, the industry by the kind of socks and pulling it up. So you set the bars up so high and the requirements are so high. It's like, you need to get over that, and what you've just given us isn't going to cut it. It doesn't matter you did that before. Read your contract. And so what that means is, yes, that really helps, and you can pull resources and knowledge and intellect together, but you still need to understand your contract in order to understand how you're going to meet the decrease in carbon requirements, greater efficiencies, minimizing your waste, and this type of thing. So I think with Fusion, because of the type of work that Fusion was doing, it wasn't necessarily generating huge amounts of waste in that sense. But of course, where we were moving, say, soil around, there was actually a soil technical standard, and soil had to be treated in a certain way. So there's like many different parts of this project that there were things seen that I'd not seen before, and probably some other people hadn't seen them either. But it just shows you the level of detail that the work was looked at. So yes, we do have metrics in this as well. But yeah, back at the project itself, I probably need to look into a bit more. It is useful to join forces. I would say though, if you want to go for longevity like BVV, you probably just need to look at aligning your cultures as well. Yeah. Otherwise that can cause a lot of friction. Does that answer the question, Neri?
Neri, are you on the call? Certainly does from my perspective anyway, Amy.
Thank you, Michelle.
Comprehensive response and use of examples as well. Okay, let's see if there's any more questions.
There's a question coming from Tom, specifically addressed to Clive. And I think after this, we should draw the event to a close, bearing in mind we're stretching our time. So Clive, I don't know if you're reading this, but Tom's question specifically is, if we consider the age of disruption, pandemic, technology, food Brexit in terms of change, freeze, unfreeze, refreeze, when do you estimate we may see the next, the refreeze phase emerging?
Well, it's taken me back to my I think the freeze, unfreeze, refreeze was the principles of change. I think, was it Cotter in those days, which was really based around a fairly steady state situation where life went on, and then you had a change, and then you had a new normal. And really, it doesn't apply, in my view, to the VUCA world that we live in today. So VUCA being volatile, uncertain, what does the C stand for? But
complex.
Complex and ambiguous. Thank you, Stephen. Because the world is just changing all the time. So I don't think there is going to be a refreeze. I'm very happy to have that discussion with anybody that wants to have it. But I think what we're seeing is massive disruption and change, ever accelerating into the future. Now, whether that does tail off and we create a paradise here on Earth and we're being governed by artificial intelligence and everybody's happy and blissful, but not expecting that in my lifetime or the lifetime of my grandchildren. So I think the only refreeze that we might see is when humanity stops warming up the planet. Forgive my cynicism. But what I did want to say though, Stephen, very briefly, because you mentioned it and Avi mentioned it, that was the piece about culture. And because it has been mentioned 2 or 3 times, and just in case anybody is thinking about that at the moment, it's really important for leaders to just to know that culture is something these days that can be measured and managed systematically. So it's no longer the art that it used to be 20 or 30 years ago. It's now something that there is a whole science around. And if anybody does want to know anything more about it, then do get in touch with me. There's not enough time to go into the detail here and now, but it is something that we've been doing at Prime East for the last 20 years, with some really good success stories under our belts.
Thank you, Clive. And that sounds like a reasonable point to finish on. I can see there's a little bit of discussion still going on in the chat, but I think we are approaching 8:30. So I think in fairness to all our attendees, we should wrap up. But if anyone would like to address any further points or questions to any of our speakers, I'm not sure that contact details will be available directly, but if you wanted to get in touch with the CQI, I'm sure we'd be able to put you in touch with the speakers to carry on any of the discussions that may have sprung to mind during their presentations this evening. So once again, Clive, David, AV, thank you very much for your time and for your contributions. It's been a really interesting debate, and I wish we could go on for longer. Am I handing back to you, Vic, for a final cheerio as the chair? I shall formally stop recording the event at this point, and perhaps leave the final word to you, Vic.
Again, it's just to say a big thank you to our speakers, also to our colleagues from the Sustainability SIG, and also to Ramel from the CQI, for all their help this evening, and also, thank you very much for everybody else for attending, and have a good time, and we'll see you again soon, I hope, at the next meeting. And I think we have our branch committee meeting next week. It's a reminder.
Okay, thank you everyone. Good evening, and we'll look forward to seeing you at our next event.
Good night, everybody.
Thank you.
Yes,
Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
Looking at some of the comments that enjoyed the event. Yeah. Good. Yeah, Stephen, I just looked at the Eventbrite, and 60 people are actually registered, including our 3 speakers and a few others who put the name down twice. So I'll say 50 odd had actually registered.
But we only had about 20 something.
20 something, yeah.
Yeah, I suppose. Yeah, I think about it. That's normally what we get, isn't it? 50%.
Yeah. It's a pity our Laura didn't turn up tonight. No, she's the vice chair.
Well, at least she knew in advance she was going to be vice chair, didn't she?
Yeah. Anyway, we'll see you next Tuesday. Thanks, and we'll go to branch committee.